I've been called a Disney shill more times than I can count by people who think that I blindly accept and adore anything Star Wars that we've gotten since the Disney acquisition of Lucasfilm in 2012.
Pete Fletcher of ATG Cast is a Disney shill. Oh yeah, big time Disney shill.
And you know what? I really do like a lot of the stuff that's been released. There's stuff that I've loved. There's stuff that I've not loved. But for example, I've loved the Mandalorian series. Andor was brilliant. Book of Boba Fett was fine, and Kenobi had some epic moments. The Disney era has also given us what, in my opinion, is the best and most important Star Wars story in Rian Johnson's The Last Jedi. They've given us a wonderful reboot of the series in The Force Awakens, and they've also given us The Rise of Skywalker.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
They've experimented with anthology films like Solo and Rogue One, which have been really strong entries into the canon. And of course, the animated shows like Rebels, Clone Wars Season 7, and The Bad Batch have been top-tier storytelling. And there were also 2 seasons of Star Wars Resistance. And don't forget about the hundreds of comic books, the dozens of novels, and the handful of video games, all of which are adding to the lore. And of course, they've launched the High Republic era of content, which will tell us stories that take place literally centuries before The Phantom Menace. And this is really fertile ground for new stories. There's also been the launch of the Galaxy's Edge theme park in Disney World and Disneyland, and the opening and closing of the multi-million-dollar Galactic Star Cruiser immersive role-playing experience / hotel. Disney's purchase of Lucasfilm and the Star Wars franchise at $4 billion has already paid for itself, regardless of what the YouTube clickbait artists are going to try to tell you. They're claiming that Star Wars is dead, but the money just keeps rolling in. However, as successful as most of the movies have been, and the merchandising juggernaut that was launched by Baby Yoda, and the resurgence of nostalgia for the first 6 episodes of the Skywalker saga, Disney may have made a minor yet critical error in their assessment of the fans they're hoping to attract.
The Emperor's made a critical error, and the time for our attack has come.
They may have overestimated the willingness of the average fan to want to dive below the surface of the massive universe that Star Wars is built upon. Both the average fan and the deep lore nerd go to Disney World and to the movies and subscribe to Disney Plus. The average fan and the nerd watch the movies and the TV shows, and they play the video games, and they go to theme parks and they buy Grogu t-shirts. But the average fan is not necessarily interested in things like Tar Vizsla, the first and only Mandalorian Jedi, and the origin of the Darksaber, because the average fan thinks, hey, that black lightsaber thing is pretty cool, and for some reason that lady Mandalorian in the blue armor wants it. The average fan also accounts for 4 out of 5 Star Wars fans, if not dramatically more. But Disney may have lost sight of the average fan and may be taking a Star Trek type approach to content development that is supporting this franchise. Now, to be clear, this is not a dig on Star Trek at all, but the Star Trek fandom was the first science fiction nerd club to come out of the basement and stand proudly in the harsh fluorescent lights of the convention halls around the world. Trekkies created fan conventions. They launched cosplay, and they became known for their deep knowledge of the fictional lore that was the underpinning of their story. Star Trek made bank by marketing to this specific group of experts who longed to live in that world, not just watch it. The owners of the Star Trek franchise went out of their way to appeal to this, in all fairness, finite group of superfans. And as a result, there was a time when being called a Star Trek fan was actually an insult.
Get a life, will you, people? Crying out loud, it's just a TV show.
Also, keep in mind that Star Trek is science fiction, whereas Star Wars is pure mythological fantasy. Sure, it's set in a world of spaceships and robots, but the underpinnings are magic and legend and the battle of good versus evil. And if you're not sure if that differentiator is enough to separate the franchises, let's look at the broad appeal based on box office, where, before streaming, franchises were able to measure their success. Star Trek has released 13 films since 1979 that have grossed $2.3 billion in the United States. Star Wars has released 12 films since 1977, and they've grossed $10.3 billion in the United States, $8 billion more. So what's my point? Well, the reason Disney paid $4 billion to become the owner of the Star Wars franchise was that they saw the potential of this Goliath to print money for years to come. And the net profit of the 5 films they've released since 2015 alone have already made that back. The billions in merchandising and licensing and Disney Plus subscriptions have made the purchase profitable. Some estimate that Disney makes between $5 and $7 billion per year in merchandise alone. And there's no end in sight. Or is there? Since Disney served up the first live-action Star Wars series when the service launched in 2019, viewership has been a bit of an unpredictable roller coaster, but the trend is on the decline. Seasons 1 and 2 of The Mandalorian were wildly successful in that the viewership was there, the merchandising machine, while delayed due to the wise choice of keeping Baby Yoda a secret, it relaunched Star Wars into the zeitgeist. The story was fresh and exciting while appealing to those that grew up with the action figures. It felt like Star Wars on TV was the way of the future. Then, the live-action Obi-Wan Kenobi series drew very high numbers out of the gate, driven by a heavy marketing campaign and drawing on prequel trilogy nostalgia. But it took a dip in the following weeks. Andor and Book of Boba Fett struggled to get 50 and 70% of the Kenobi numbers, and Mandalorian Season 3 continued this waning trend. Now, to be fair, the quantifiable data that the streaming services offer up is harder to decipher than the Da Vinci Code, and it's really one of the reasons why the writers and actors are currently on strike. But what is clear is, regardless of the numbers, the magic of the first 2 seasons of The Mandalorian has not been able to be repeated. The buzz is not what it was, and the anti-Disney arm of the internet is loudly shouting from their YouTube megaphones that Star Wars is dying. Why? What changed? Well, first off, I just want to say I'm not going to give any credence to those that say that it's Disney's alleged political agenda that's bringing the numbers down. That is simply rhetoric inspired by our current political climate. However, many people do say it's franchise fatigue. Others say that the quality of the shows isn't quite up to snuff. And while there's no doubt that there is a lot of Star Wars to be had and the quality is purely a subjective metric, I think that it's because of the overdependence on the lore that it's built and a misunderstanding of the broader fan base. The Mandalorian Season 2 threaded the needle of introducing characters only known to animation fans in a way that continued to make the story accessible to the average fan. And whether us shills want to admit it or not, even the most successful animation gets only a fraction of the live-action show's viewership. For example, about 2.2 million people watched The Bad Batch Season 1 versus about 16.7 million who watched Season 1 of The Mandalorian. However, the introduction of Ahsoka Tano from the Clone Wars and the Rebels cartoons was handled perfectly. People who knew the character were floored to see her in live action, and those that didn't know her, well, they welcomed her as some cool Jedi character. For the episode to work, there was no need to know her story as Anakin Skywalker's Padawan and her tragic exit from the Jedi Order and her role as a secret agent named Fulcrum in the burgeoning rebellion, but that story was there for those that wanted to get it. When Bo-Katan was introduced in the same season of Mando, her extensive backstory from the animation wasn't needed either. She was just another Mandalorian that forced our hero Din Djarin to realize that the devout dogma he's been following may or may not be the way as he had lived his whole life. The story flowed, historical knowledge was not necessary, and the viewer could enjoy what they were watching without needing to have seen any other content. In fact, Mando's first 2 seasons were written so well that I would argue that there wasn't even really a need to have ever seen any other Star Wars. Showrunners Dave Filoni and Jon Favreau introduced these characters to people who had never met them before, and by not feeling the need to share their full stories to make them work in the new environment, they also served existing fans better by avoiding the risk of retconning their stories or treading on a fan's headcanon. As I said earlier, Star Trek had become the kind of exclusive club with membership reliant on one's deep understanding of the multiple worlds, the aliens, and the characters that made up the canon. And as a result, and as proven by those box office numbers and merchandising, exclusivity breeds exclusion. You may have loved a Star Trek show or a movie, but you may not have gotten as much out of it if you didn't know the lore. Or worse, you may not have been able to follow the story if you didn't have a working knowledge of Vulcan philosophy or warp speed technology or Klingon culture. Now, when The Mandalorian returned for Season 3, a working knowledge of Mandalorian lore as first delivered in animation was not essential, but certainly added to that experience. And while the nerdiest of fans loved it and felt rewarded for the time that they'd put into other Star Wars canon and other media, it left some people feeling a little left out. The once simple story of a man choosing between creed and found family became a complex tale of clashing clans and ancient traditions. While shills like me found this to be very interesting, it may have been confounding for casual fans. In addition, an entire episode that didn't even feature the titular character was spent building new lore and setting the stage for the highly political New Republic era in which most of the live-action series stories are being told. While the first seasons of The Mandalorian were a very personal lone wolf and cub type story, the series felt like it was switching direction and putting focus on the universe in which it was taking place. For those that came for the Bounty Hunter and the Baby Yoda adventure of the week, this was a great time to check out, and many of them did. Another challenge for Disney came with the Book of Boba Fett. The enigmatic bounty hunter had lived in the minds of fans since he was introduced as an action figure in 1979. He skulked through the screen in The Empire Strikes Back before his unceremonious demise in the first 30 minutes of Return of the Jedi, with less screen time than a group of Jawas. But he was a fan favorite. Comic books and legend stories said that he survived his clumsy misfire into the Sarlacc pit, and his infamy grew in the heads of fans. When he was reintroduced in The Mandalorian, he was an epic brute. He was smashing stormtrooper armor with his gaffy stick. He was ruthlessly killing anyone who got in his way. And then a post-credits scene in the Season 2 finale of The Mandalorian promised more cold-blooded Boba Fett in his own show. But some fans felt like it was a bait and switch. The Book of Boba Fett showed a reformed man trying to make his way in the universe, as his father once said.
I'm just a simple man trying to make my way in the universe.
The once fierce and mysterious bounty hunter was humanized. He didn't even wear his signature helmet half the time, and he was no longer the steely underworld anti-hero. This did not align with the headcanon created by fans for more than 40 years. And at the same time, they were making references to and they were relying on content that was not explored deeply in live action, such as the Pike Crime Syndicate or the Hutt clans and the comic book baddie Black Chrysanthemum. This show also delivered the ultimate message to fans that all content is required content. 2 of the 7 episodes of the Boba Fett series were Mandalorian and Grogu stories that completely left out the title character. Not only that, but it closed the cliffhanger of whether the child would stay with Luke Skywalker or return to his father figure Din Djarin. The biggest event from The Mandalorian Season 2 was resolved on a completely different show. And this is a proof point that Disney may have miscalculated the Star Wars fan base, and it's putting the prized franchise at risk. Look, as a Disney shill, I appreciate the Easter eggs, and I love the callbacks and all the connections to the other content. Honestly, they don't even need to provide trailers for the Star Wars shows or movies for me, because I'm going to watch them. I'm even going to watch them if I don't like them. And when the writers and actors aren't on strike, I sing the praises of what I like, and I appropriately challenge what I don't like on our YouTube channels and podcasts. But I'm not the average fan. The very reasons for which I take issue with the Rise of Skywalker, for example,
Somehow Palpatine returned.
are the exact reasons casual Star Wars fan friends of mine love it. Rise of Skywalker and The Force Awakens were full of nostalgia. It brought back familiar faces, and it felt like Star Wars. You literally could have watched either one of those movies as your first Star Wars experience and walked out of the theater fully understanding what you saw, and you would have enjoyed it. Now listen, I'm not passing judgment on one way to manage a franchise or another, but I'm pointing out that Disney may have overestimated the number of fans who want to be immersed in the canon or who are experts in the history and live life as an unabashed, deep lore nerd. I believe that they think that the majority of Star Wars fans eat, drink, and sleep Star Wars, but while that type of fan is out there, the percentage of people walking around in a Bo-Katan t-shirt or buying a Darth Vader Funko Pop without knowing anything beyond the information they've seen in live action is a lot higher than they think. The Galactic Star Cruiser is a prime example. When I first read about the 3-day, 2-night experience, after I got over the sticker shock, I immediately was trying to figure out how and when I could afford to go. To be completely immersed in a Star Wars story for a weekend was something that I had always dreamed of as a super fan. However, the number of people who want to live this sort of Star Wars experience, exorbitant price tag aside, is actually very limited. And that limit was reached earlier this year when they announced that in September 2023, they would close this experimental attraction for good. They also tried to make Galaxy's Edge, or Star Wars Land as most people call it, an immersive experience set in the sequel era, featuring Kylo Ren, First Order stormtroopers, and Rey making the rounds as living character experiences. And this is not a commentary on the quality of the sequel trilogy, but if most of your audience calls it Star Wars Land, Their expectation may be that they will see all of Star Wars, which would include Darth Vader, R2-D2, Yoda, and other characters from across the Star Wars timeline. Disneyland and Disney World have begun featuring the Mandalorian and Grogu, as well as Boba Fett and Ahsoka, as characters that you can speak to at the theme park in an effort to broaden that appeal. And I think this is the first sign that Disney understands this miscalculation. So how do you keep deep lore nerds fed while allowing the casual fans to stay attached and committed to new stories instead of feeling like Star Wars is becoming this increasingly exclusive club? And this is important. There's always going to be an audience who want to know the background story of Max Rebo, thank you, Daniel Jose Older, or the history of Mandalore, or even where lightsabers come from. Keep making content that deepens the stories for those that want it. There's financial proof that there's profit in this part of the fandom. And as a reward for those fans, keep making references all day long. Put helmets from an animated show in the background. Introduce characters from other media. Introduce their story naturally. Storytellers just need to remember, though, that the vast majority of the Star Wars fandom have never watched a moment of an animated series or seen a single panel in a comic book. Create content that connects the stories, but make sure it isn't homework. Remember that what made Star Wars successful is that it's sci-fi fantasy adventure. The first time the masses turned on the Star Wars franchise was when The Phantom Menace featured taxation and politics in the opening crawl. The landscape and environment are really important to any good story, but when it's done well, it's understood through context. Finally, Star Wars lives off humor that a 10-year-old will laugh at, and magic that requires a suspension of disbelief, and a core story of heroes and family that's built on hope. Nostalgia will keep the franchise alive across the generations, and new stories and characters who reflect the newest fans themselves will carry it forward. If the stories are good, a percentage will want to know about the lore that's been created. Where did that character come from? What's their backstory? New and casual fans alike will take that deep dive into the thousands of hours of backstory that's available. But if the new content can be driven by these elements and present stories that are strong on their own, Star Wars will live on forever. It's not dead like so many would have you believe.